Back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 17th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 United States Senate elections. As of the middle of May, months away from the campaign season going into full force after Labor Day here, a very interesting snapshot in time as to where the Senate races are today, with ad reservations tumbling into the hundreds of millions of dollars going into this coming fall, a very high expectation that many of these key and competitive races will be at the forefront of these individual battleground states. States like Montana and Ohio and Arizona expect to see many people headlining the super important race there as the Senate race rather than the presidential, especially given that in some of these battleground states, maybe Arizona is the exception, but in a number of these battleground states in the Senate races, for example, Montana, Ohio, even potentially Maryland, depending on how that goes in the next coming months here, it's going to be very obvious that the Senate election is amongst the most important races because it does determine the balance of power in the Congress, determines the balance of power for each political party, and really will determine who can be a successful executive or not, depending on who wins the White House. And so a lot of things are at play here in Senate elections. It's sort of mini presidential elections, if that makes sense. These are statewide elections here that have national implications where people are very much voting, how they're going to vote on the presidential level. And the Senate race is a little bit different than they would maybe on a gubernatorial race. And so people are looking at this as not only an extension of their own voice and their own party preference, but also the party preference of the country. And so for a lot of these states here with competitive races, a lot of polarization that has, completely ravaged across the United States. A lot of what polarization has done, this hyper-polarized America that we are in, has reduced the number of red state Democratic senators, blue state Republican senators, and that's because people just, quite frankly, don't cross-party vote the way they used to. And so we're at a unique point where potentially this election could be the tipping point for some of these super competitive races, mostly on the Democratic side, where there won't be enough crossover votes to allow some Democrats or potentially some Republicans even to do well in their races, and it could be a very interesting campaign season. And so where we are today is that we have 34 races that are up for election. Traditionally speaking, we only have about 33. Around a third of the Senate seats are up every 2 years. This time, Nebraska has a special election after one of the senators there actually decided to retire and remove themselves from office to become the president of the University of Florida. And so it's interesting to see now we have 34 races here, but 34 races obviously are not all of the races that matter. There's going to be significantly less because that's how campaigns work and that's how this election works as well. There are safe Democratic states, safe Republican states, and we're going to spend the time and characterize all of those right now, and they really don't need to have that much reasoning behind them. If I was to make a blanket statement about practically all of them, they are way too partisan to even consider electing a member of the opposition party. These are states like California and New York, and surprisingly enough, based on the incumbents that we see, such as Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota or Tim Kaine in the state of Virginia, they're too strong of incumbents to really have competitive races. And so while some of these states may in fact be more competitive on the presidential level, they are significantly less competitive on the Senate level. We saw this back in 2020 when senators like Jeanne Shaheen won in states like New Hampshire by 15, 16 points, despite Joe Biden winning by around 7 points. And so while Joe Biden did ultimately win the state, the victory there for the Democratic senator was well above an 8-point over performance on the Democratic side on the Senate level, and was a very solid characterization and one that we knew going straight into this election. And so many of these other states are the exact same way. With that being said, we only have about 41 races off the bat that we immediately characterize as safe Democrat, but there actually is another state that I would like to characterize as a safe Democratic state in this upcoming election, and that is the state of Maryland. Now, I know there's been a lot of conversation about Larry Hogan, the former Republican governor who left office with a 67% approval rating, running for the U.S. Senate race there. Maryland is not a state that likes to vote red on the presidential, Senate, or even House of Representatives level. Maryland is a blue state through and through, and Governor Larry Hogan won in 2014 in an anti-Obama year, became a very popular Republican incumbent, ran for re-election in 2018, and won by around 12 percentage points. Now, the problem is that in a state like Maryland, it is too blue for Democrats to fail, meaning that regardless of who Republicans are running, and I mean this earnestly, regardless of who they are running, Democrats will always win. And that's the same case on the Senate level. I think a lot of the hype that we've seen around Governor Larry Hogan is largely because voters recognize his name and they like his name. But that doesn't mean they like him for the U.S. Senate. Earlier on in this video, I talked to you about how voters keep in mind the overall objective of Senate races here. They nationalize these races because there are very much national implications. When you are a Democrat voting for a Republican senator, you are handing over power to people like Mitch McConnell and J.D. Vance and John Thune and well-known Republican members of the Senate delegation. And so when you see things like that, you become worried about electing somebody who could be identified with that party, who is identifying with that party to the national level. rather than a gubernatorial race where, in many people's minds too, Governor Larry Hogan was throttled by the Democratic supermajority. Democrats had safeguards in place to ensure that there wasn't circumstances in which Larry Hogan, as a Republican governor, could enact things like a pro-life legislation, or couldn't enact anti-LGBT laws, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, different things that Democrats really worry about from Republican governors and legislators, they knew couldn't happen on a statewide level. On a federal level, things are different. And you start to see it now in some of the most recent polls from the Hill and Emerson College that show that Angela Alsobrooks, now the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate in Maryland, is defeating Larry Hogan by roughly 10 points. And I only expect that to increase. As Joe Biden is expected to win the state by roughly 30 points, this is the last bit of energy and discussion I really will give to the state of Maryland, even though it is my home state and I love it dearly. It's not going to be competitive. It will be more competitive, but you're talking a reduction of a state that's going to be Biden plus 33 to Alsobrooks plus 20. Yes, a reduction in support. Larry Hogan gets some of that appeal that he had to independents and left-leaning voters from 2018 to roll over to 2024, but certainly, and I mean this honestly, certainly not enough to narrow down the state. I said in multiple times that the closest Republicans can get it is to likely blue. Today, I have it at safe blue. With that being said, Democrats are now at 42 seats. Republicans are at 38. Let's move on. Let's talk about some other states that are going to be now safe Republican rather than safe Democrat. And this is where you start to see exactly how this map becomes so lopsided in favor of the GOP. States like Wyoming and Nebraska and Utah are the states with current Republican incumbents that are running for re-election. And the Democrats used to hold some of these states. They used to hold states like North Dakota and Indiana and West Virginia and Missouri. And in fact, they still hold West Virginia. But it is immediately a Republican pickup because of the fact that it is a state that has Senator Joe Manchin retiring from the U.S. Senate, and he's out, which means the Republicans are going to easily swoop in. And so West Virginia right now is a state that I would say at the baseline is a safe Republican pickup. Governor Jim Justice just won the nomination there for the Senate GOP primary. It's not going to be competitive. No matter how competitive it was in years past, West Virginia is now a red state through and through. Easy flip for the Republican Party. But that brings us to 48 seats for the Republicans, 42 for the Democrats. If Donald Trump is to win the presidential election, Republicans just need 1/5 of the remaining toss-up seats in order to win Senate control. If Donald Trump loses the presidential election, they need one more seat than 1/5, which is 3 out of 10. And so this puts Democrats at a disadvantage, largely because of the map they're working with. Democrats are defending territory in a number of states that Donald Trump won in 2016, and many of which that he won in the 2020 presidential election. In fact, if you were to take the states that Donald Trump won in the 2020 presidential election, Republicans at the baseline would already have 52 seats in the U.S. Senate. But that's not how easy everything is. But polarization is making it more difficult to see a map like this one come to reality. I've talked to you a lot about cross-party voting, and right now Democrats actually have incumbents in enough states right now that they actually have the majority in these seats. Montana, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, which brings them to 50 seats. And with Vice President Harris is a majority. West Virginia, of course, with Joe Manchin, the Democrat there, but we can take that out of consideration because it's not going to happen again in 2024. And so Democrats certainly do have at least some level of electoral prowess to stand on, to say that we won these states before, we've won them multiple times, what's to say we can't win them again? Well, it's presidential election territory, and again, polarization has gotten the better of many key and crucial House of Representatives members, many key and crucial senators, and I wonder if this election will be different. And I honestly can't tell you. What I'm going to do is do the easy states first. The states that we determine to be likely red or likely blue, meaning that they're anywhere between a 5 to 15% margin of victory. Reasonably speaking, it's a more accurate way of predicting how these states are going to go in terms of margin, and they also reveal a lot about probability. If a state is going to be in the likely column, chances are Republicans are probably going to win it. We could bet on it a year out from the election, but it wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world if Democrats were to win them, because Democrats in some of these cases have come very close for instances like Texas in the 2018 midterm elections, or in Florida where they won there and had a Democratic incumbent actually up until 2019 in the U.S. Senate. And so you do find that in many of these states, and in many of these battleground districts too that we'll talk about in the future when we use characterizations like these, that, a lot of it has to do with past election history, expected election performance, and just generally speaking, margin. That is what we base this on. And so on that alone, I fully do expect Republicans to, regardless of margin, to win states like Florida and even win states like Texas. My last prediction had Ted Cruz performing worse than where I have him performing today. But given Joe Biden's numbers, given the polling that we find in Texas, not only on the presidential level, but also on the Senate level, it isn't super strong for people like Colin Allred. When you take a look at the head-to-head matchup here against Colin Alred, Ted Cruz leads by roughly 8 points. Now, I will give him grace in the sense that in 2018, they said that Ted Cruz would defeat Beto O'Rourke by anywhere by 9 to 10 points, and it ended up being roughly less than 3 points. And so certainly the polls have been wrong in Texas. But in 2020, they also said Trump would win by less than a point, and he won by 6 points. And so it isn't a perfect science, and I don't claim to know Texas through and through. But what I do know is that in an environment like this one, where Biden is expected to perform worse on the presidential than he did in 2020, I don't see a reality in which a Republican loses a Senate race in Texas, even if it is somebody like Ted Cruz, who I do think in some cases, including this one, would underperform President Trump. And so that brings us down to roughly 8 seats remaining. Republicans are already at 50, which means Republicans need just 1 out of the remaining 8 toss-ups. Now, an easy one that I'll characterize as likely blue is New Mexico. I've revised it for my safe Democratic characterization because it surprised us in the past with surprisingly close elections that receive 0 national attention, 0 media buy-in, and yet Democrats still, of course, pull ahead, but it's surprisingly close. I think something similar might happen this time around, but there are some more concrete ones that I think Republicans also started to realize maybe aren't as favorable for them as they otherwise might have thought. States like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where Republicans have yet to spend excessive amounts of funds in the way the Democrats have in terms of ad buys. Democrats are defending a lot of territory. They're defending themselves in key battleground states, and Republicans aren't backing a lot of these states. Right now, it looks like their pathway is focusing through Ohio and Montana. And it's interesting, and we'll cover that in a future video because it's a very interesting strategy to employ, especially as the party looking to gain so many different seats because your Senate majority, despite being 2 away from a majority or 1 away, depending on who's president, it also is quite thin in terms of who you're talking about to support you time and time again. People like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins are probably the, comparable point to the Joe Manchins and Kyrsten Sinemas of the chamber. So it's very interesting to see. Right now, the Republicans are at 50, Democrats are at 45. It will be interesting to see how the remainder of these states play out. With that being said, I don't think any of these remaining states are going to be characterized as likely or safe. Montana, Michigan, Ohio, Nevada, Arizona are probably going to be amongst the closest of this election cycle. If I was to say one that would be less close than the others, it would certainly be Michigan. And I think that's why I'm going to start off by characterizing it as a lean Democratic state. Right now, Michigan is at a unique point where it is rejecting President Biden in a way that we didn't see them reject President Biden in 2020. Then Vice President Biden reject Secretary Hillary Clinton in 2016. I mean, we have seen Michigan as a, reliable state in terms of polling and in terms of performance. 2016, though, it did go to Trump. So when I say they didn't reject her, I meant in the polls there. But the polls today are rejecting Joe Biden in a way that we just simply haven't seen for any other Democratic contender. But it's interesting because in 2022, the polls were dead wrong. They did say Gretchen Whitmer would win, but they said she would win by roughly 1 point. She ended up winning by 10. And so when you find discrepancies like those, you start to trust the polls a lot less, especially in key and crucial states that you have the methodologies. You have had years to perfect the ways that you do polls, and yet they almost always get them wrong in Michigan, one way or the other. And so right now, I think Democrats could perform better than the polls suggest, even though they do suggest a Democratic victory. I just don't think they're going to blow it out of the water because of the president's performance in this battleground state. And so Michigan right now, lean blue state, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, popular Democratic incumbents running for re-election, a bit different on that front. I expect those to be likely blue, and that brings us down to 4 remaining toss-up states. Montana, Ohio, Nevada, and Arizona. I'm going to start off on the West Coast, where I think 2 of these states are going to vote together, and I think both of them are going to vote blue. Arizona Democrats have just recently upped their ad buy in the state and also are just performing very well when it comes down to statewide polls. In polls where Biden is losing the state by 7 to 10 points, they have Ruben Gallego winning by 3 to 5 points. I mean, the amount of crossover support you are seeing when Carrie Lake is the Republican nominee is absolutely astronomical, and it is very strong for the Democratic Party and a very good sign for their chances this coming November. Because while it isn't good news for President Biden, everything else checks out. Democrats are winning in the House races there. They're winning in the Senate race there. Everything about Arizona, at least on the fundamentals, screams purple state. And so Democrats, combined with lackluster Republicans, such as Carrie Lake, can absolutely win in states like these. The difference is the presidential, which is why I'm cautioned away from making it a likely blue state. Even with the abortion referendum, I think Arizona is still going to be lean blue. With Nevada, on the other hand, I think despite President Biden's numbers too, Jackie Rosen has been doing quite well. She's also popular, and Republicans almost always, in fact always since the 2012 election, including midterms, have overestimated Republican support in that state. In 2016, Trump was supposed to win it, he lost it. In 2018, Dean Heller was supposed to win it, he lost it. In 2020, Trump was supposed to win it, he lost it. In 2022, Adam Laxalt was supposed to win it, and he lost it. Nevada, Arizona, Michigan. Likely blue states for right now. Now that leaves us with 2 toss-ups. That leaves us at a point where Democrats are in a very, very interesting, debacle. Montana, Ohio, 2 states Trump won by strong margins in both 2016 and 2020. Ohio, 8 points twice. Montana, 16 to 20 points, or 20 to 16 points. Very, very strong state for Donald Trump. And so when you see these 2 states really coming into the last iteration of the rounds of toss-up states, who really questions, do Democrats have enough to win in these states? Do they have enough funds, resources, energy, enthusiasm? I mean, you are talking about Democrats on the defense, being able to win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. I mean, you are talking a plethora of battleground states. And Democrats are doing it so far. But these 2 states I think Democrats should be most worried about. Because it isn't just that they're playing defense in these states. They are playing defense against probably one of the most powerful set of players that they have seen in an election cycle, and that is the Trump campaign. When Donald Trump inevitably, and he will do this, when he inevitably wins Montana and Ohio, it will be a question of how many Trump and Sherrod Brown voters there are in Ohio and Trump and Jon Tester voters there are in Montana. And that number is going to dwindle dramatically from what it might have been 8 years ago, if this was the 2016 election. Because in 2018, Democrats benefited from the fact that this Senate race was the top of the ticket in both states. Sherrod Brown had a phenomenal campaign in 2018 and still only won by 6. But right now, Democrats actually have some good news out of Ohio. They know that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on Bernie Moreno, and there already has been. He's a scandal-plagued candidate who was probably the least electable Republican who could have won the nomination, and won the nomination he did. And so Ohio right now is at a unique point where Sherrod Brown, being a popular incumbent with a lot of money and the proper set of defensive strategy that could actually win the state, I think Ohio's in a point where it's roughly tilt blue. Before I had it at lean blue, and I understood the characterization for that. But I think the closer that we get to Election Day, the slight nudges we've seen and increases in support we've seen for former President Donald Trump, and I think that would do damage to the Democratic base in Ohio, would do damage to somebody like Sherrod Brown. Where I think it will do the most damage isn't Ohio, but actually Montana. Well, I do think a lot of the data that we see out of Montana does suggest, sure, that Jon Tester's in a strong position. Survey USA has him up by 7 points. Other polls have him up against Tim Sheehy. But Montana is still a Republican state. Donald Trump does well in this state, has done well, will do well, and so will down-ballot Republicans. I do think there's a reality in which Jon Tester wins it. But based on the numbers I'm seeing today, and these are snapshots in time, Republicans do win Montana. I think Jon Tester, and I don't want this to be lost because of my final prediction having it as a red state, this should not be lost. Republicans can lose Montana and Democrats can win it. It's probably going to be more Republicans losing it rather than Democrats winning it, but it doesn't really matter because it ends up with a 6-year term again for Senator Jon Tester. But where we are right now, with Trump's numbers, with Biden's numbers, with the National Republicans' numbers, and based on the ad reservations that we've seen in Montana and Ohio, this is really where the Republican Party is doing the most offense. And they have a President Trump, to carry them across the finish line. And so we will see what happens. I think Ohio may hold out because it's Trump plus 8, but I think inevitably Montana is going to be at least Trump plus 15. And so that is a huge hurdle that not even Governor Steve Bullock could overturn. And while Jon Tester is stronger than Steve Bullock, he's established, he's an incumbent, he knows Montana and has won Montana. I don't know if that carries him across the finish line this election. We will see. I'm intrigued to know, but as of today, May 17th, 2024, Republicans win back Senate control, 51-49. Democrats sweep the key and crucial battleground states, but it just isn't enough. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.